enjoying having the luxury of reading all the recent, or all of the journals for this particular talk. And one constant name from virtually the beginning, not quite the beginning, is Liz. Liz's name at the bottom of secretary, so it is quite astonishing. So what I want to do is in a similar whistle-stop fashion, take you through some of what I think are the highlights of the journal as I was reading them recently. I've never read them all the way through before. A lot of articles I've not seen before, so it was a great privilege to be able to look through them. So this was the first edition, very first edition, the Journal of the Richmond Society History section, and you've got the Wenceslaus Holler image, which remains on the journal for the first 13 editions. And there's a little note at the bottom of this inside saying, the residents of Richmond are showing increased interest in their local history, and it is hoped that this new journal of the history section of the Richmond Society will not only benefit those who want to read more about the past of the borough, but also stimulate others to carry out research and contribute future articles to it. And so that's definitely one of the missions of this current committee, is to encourage people to do more actual research and get your fingers dirty in the archives at the National at Kew. And this first one was edited by Stephen Passmore. What was Stephen's role as in sort of history? What was his job?
He was a medical doctor.
He was a medical doctor.
Based in Kensington in the war years.
Right, okay. Yeah. So then over time it evolved, of course. It became the Journal of the Richmond Local History Society in 1986. And then in 94, and with a new format and a new logo on a new picture on the front, so you can see the big difference between the two. Stephen decided to hand over the editorship. The editor feels it is time a younger member of the society took his place. He was the young 84 at that point. And David Blomfield then took over. He was an Oxford classics scholar who ran the Reader's Digest condensed books business, which was interesting. And his editing shows, the quality of his editing is very good. But I wanted to point out one thing. So one of the things about the journal is that it's we're very keen on footnotes, endnotes, and making sure that everything is, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in terms of quality. But that doesn't mean you can't have fun. And then on the first edition of David Blomfield's series, he had one called The Royal Loo. You see that? Which I thought was amusing anyway. Subsequent editors, Simon Fowler, who's of course our vice chair and the person who organises all our talks, and Robert Smith, now our former chair and now vice president. And Robert's editorship, in fact, the last four, there's two of them, they won awards for both their quality of the articles, the editing, and the production. I like this particular one. You probably can't see it at the back, but it's about Betty Nuttall, and she was the tennis player who won the US Open in the 1930s and was a real star at the time, a sort of Raducanu of her day. And then we've had a regular group of writers. I'm sure I've not included everyone. Stephen Bartlett, Ron Berryman, Ron McEwen, Robert Wood, Stephen Woodbridge, and various others. And we're also looking for more regular researchers and writers for future editions. So if you're interested, please, I'll say more about that shortly. The key person behind, as Paul was saying, the key person behind the whole evolution of the society and the magazine, and indeed Richmond Museum, was this man, John Cloak, former ambassador in Bulgaria. He was, interestingly, ambassador at the time of the Georgy Markov killing. Do you remember that? poison-tipped umbrella on Waterloo Bridge. So he won't have been in any of the news cuttings, but he will have been very engaged in that. And then he retired in 1980 and then gave his life to the Richmond History Society and everything to do with Richmond history. And here he is opening, or the Queen's opening the museum for which he was very responsible for in 1988. But he had been interested in history of Richmond since the 1960s when he first moved. He was born and grew up in Wimbledon, but when he moved to Richmond, and he's in his late 30s by this stage with his wife, he started to really get interested in Richmond. And he wrote a rather interesting article in the edition of 2004, where he talks about how he got interested in Richmond history. And I love this little passage, which I thought I could read to you. He said, "My job in the Foreign Office at this time in the mid-60s was one that enabled me most days to take a full hour's break for lunch. I would ring the PRO, the Public Record Office, not the one in Kew, but the one in Chancery Lane, in advance to ask for a document to be got out for me, jump into a taxi, hastily bolt down a pre-purchased sandwich in the taxi on the way to the Chancery Lane PRO, and get in some 35 to 40 minutes of research before emerging to grab a taxi back. I had soon built up such a mass of information on the whole area around Ormond Road and the Vineyard before and after the building of the Rosary. And then on Saturday mornings, I would often go down to the Richmond Library on Little Green, then and chat up, I'm not sure what he means by that, anyway, chat up Diana Howard, the reference librarian. The local collection for Richmond was housed in a porter cabin out at the back. Diana would let me in as she got to know me better, just to give me the key and leave me to it. From the rate books, one of my first lines of study, I found the names of many people who had lived in the Rosary over the years. So he was really getting involved in the documents and the raw material of history, which really you get a flavour of that in that description. But his big claim to fame was what he did with Richmond Palace. You know, we're used to knowing something of the shape of Richmond Palace. We've all been to the museum and seen the model. But that was completely down to the work that he did, obviously with others, but he pulled it all together. And he was involved in the Time Team survey in the grounds of Trumpeters Lodge, along with Tony Robinson, who was famously Baldric in Blackadder. But ever the pedantic, he wasn't absolutely convinced by the work of the programme. So he said, a lot of good fun is wrapped around a serious, if rushed, archaeological investigation, but I cannot accept the conclusion being that the whole building was made of brick. And he argued, again, relying on the core sources that he found in the National Archives, that that wasn't the case. So just pointing some of the other fascinating articles, in fact, Paul mentioned this one when he read out the list of the articles in the very first edition, Vincent van Gogh in Richmond and Petersham. We know about his links with Isleworth, the fact that he taught at a school there, and you can go and see the blue plaque on the old boarding school where he taught. But he writes this rather wonderful passage to his brother, who was his sponsor really, in his late 20s, of walking through Richmond from Isleworth. It was a clear day and a beautiful walk from here to Richmond along the Thames, in which the great chestnut trees with their load of yellow leaves and the clear blue sky were mirrored. Through the tops of the trees one could see that part of Richmond which lies on the hill, the houses with their red roofs, uncurtained windows and red and green gardens, and the grey spire high above them, and below the long grey bridge with the tall poplars on either side, over which the people passed like little black figures. You just wish that he could have painted that rather than described it, but he was, it's just beautiful. And of course, he was famous for his using of yellow, so that was interesting. In the letter that he wrote to his brother Theo, he did do a little sketch of a couple of the places that he had spoken at or preached at. One was in Turnham Green, the other one on the left is the Wesleyan Church in Petersham that was pulled down in the 1890s. So I rather like that article. Another article I liked was this one about the Star and Garter. Of course, the Star and Garter has gone through many changes over the years. But back in the, well, originally, of course, it was a hotel. In the mid-1800s, in the Victorian era, it was owned by this man on the left, who was a self-made man from Staffordshire called Joseph Ellis. And one of the things about the society is that we have fantastic access to all kinds of distinguished people and people who are linked to the area for many decades. And this article was written by one of the great-grandchildren of Joseph Ellis, Valentine Ellis. And he was able to bring all sorts of interesting information to the story. That photograph is a photograph in his possession. This is an illustration from the Victorian era of the Star and Garter. You can just make out the words of the Star and Garter on the entrance. It was a very thorough article, and it described how he bought it, improved it, sold it for double what he had bought it for, £2.3 million in today's money. But then there was this rather amusing sale brochure that was obviously in the possession of the family. And one of the particulars read, the hotel's clientele included kings, queens, princes, the occasional emperor and empress, and lesser mortals such as Disraeli, Gladstone, Dickens, Thackeray, Tennyson, etc. Louis Philippe, King of the French, stayed for 6 months on one occasion. And then there's this appendix, which again is illustrative of the times. You know, you can't imagine seeing this kind of family list today, but you can probably make out that they had 13 children and 72 grandchildren. Now, I know there are various grandparents in the audience who, you know, struggle with maybe 1 or 2 grandchildren. Could you imagine 72 of them? One of the other features, which I think is quite interesting, because they obviously, the editors were thinking about how do we fill, you know, an annual journal. We're very reliant on contributions from members, and we also want to maintain the standards. So occasionally they would fill the content by adding a series of sections called Richmond Miscellanea, and I picked out a couple of interesting stories. One was for Sir Robert Paston to his wife in 1666, remember, this is very early. This day, the bells proclaim the King's birth, this is Charles II, and great preparation and jollity everywhere. I am going to court to visit their majesties, and therefore take the opportunity of the moment to write to you. The squire of the body, that's his assistant, tells me he saw your son very well engaged in a game of cricket on Richmond Green, 1666. That's very, very early. And then another one of these little excerpts was the story of Nightingale Lane. So if any of you have ever tried to run up Nightingale Lane, which I have, and nearly died, but I was interested in the story. It is not known why Nightingale Lane is so called. The suggestion that the cottage on the hill was built by a Sir William Nightingale as being more probable than that nightingales used to sing close by appears to be wholly without foundation. But there is no reason to dismiss the nightingales. To quote from Wordsworth, a Wordsworth sonnet from 1820, fame tells of groves from England far away, groves that inspire the nightingale to trill and modulate with subtle reach of skill, elsewhere unmatched, her ever-varying lay. Such bold report I venture to gainsay, for I have heard the choir of Richmond Hill chanting with indefatigable bill strains that recall to mind a distant day. So I thought, wow, how on earth did he come across that? He must have known Wordsworth very well. Of course, this is in the days before Google, so he couldn't have just done a quick search. I thought that was really, really impressive. That was John Cloke's discovery. One of the things as I was reading through, some of the great detective work that was done by individual writers, you know, they weren't just taking material from other biographies or other histories. They were doing a lot of their own work. And this one by Ron Berryman, who's still, is Ron here today? Hey, Ron, hey. One of the series of articles he did was on Richmond Hill, and there's this prospect of Richmond in Surrey, which you've probably seen, but never really noticed, but he did, some curious things which weren't correct. And the big one that he pointed out in one of the articles, was this here, that was meant to be Trumpeter's house, I think. And this is right on the river. Of course, Trumpeter's house isn't right on the river. So that was a clue to the fact that something was not up. And then he's looked at various other places and realized that actually this isn't a photographic representation of Richmond at that time. Having said that, we wouldn't know anything about it. We wouldn't have had any kind of sense of what it was like. So on the one hand, it's not perfectly accurate, but as Ron says, at least we've got some sense of what Georgian Richmond was like. And then he also did, in that same theme, but afterwards, a couple of articles on the fight to save Richmond, the view from Richmond, from Richmond Hill, which is obviously very famous. And actually, I was intrigued by that. So this was a personal selection of articles, because in the summer, I went to Richmond, Virginia. And of course, Richmond, Virginia is named after Richmond, Surrey here, and all to do with the view. And I went with my wife, Alison, and she sat down on this hill, and I was just doing something in the car, and then came out. And as I stood behind her, I said, "Oh my God!" I mean, the view in Richmond, Virginia, of the James River is exactly the same as the bend of the river here of the Thames. It is quite striking.
I met the mayor of Richmond, Virginia.
Oh yes.
15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And he said how sad that this is gone because they built it in front of it.
So there are some buildings. There's a Lucky Strike Tower. I don't think that was built in the last 15 years. No, it's not as perfectly preserved, and that's again the value of the fight to save. So that's a great point. But nevertheless, you could still get a sense of it, and you could see why William Byrd named Richmond, Virginia, after Richmond here. So a couple of other fascinating articles, again, my personal selection. There was a great one on Trumpeter's House. I hope some of you have signed up to come to the Trumpeter's House party on Saturday. It'd be great to see you if you have. But again, after some real detective work, Sloke found that it was built on the orders of a man called Richard Hill, another ambassador like himself. And that was in 1703 and 4 when it was built. There was another wonderful article on the pens of Petersham. So if you've ever walked in the graveyard at Petersham Church, you can come across the graves of the great-grandchildren of William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania. So that's a great story. And then the one I didn't expect, a kind of left-field article that Simon Fowler and Robert Wood wrote about, was this man Chiang Li. And Chiang Li was otherwise known as the Silent Traveller, and he wrote the Silent Travels, the Silent Traveller in London. But I first came across him. I regularly go to the Yorkshire Dales, and when I was in Boston, in the US, I came across this slim volume, secondhand, of The Silent Traveller in the Yorkshire Dales by this man Chiang Li. But anyway, this article in Richmond History has a couple of wonderful paintings that he produced, prompted by his trip to Richmond. So to the future, we have, I'm happy to say, a new editor, Julian Holden, who's here. Julie, do you want to stand up briefly, just so everyone knows? So if you've got some article ideas, or please, talk to him, because he's definitely on the lookout for the next edition and future editions. We've also got the Monday Research Club that Simon Fowler runs on first Monday of every month. Again, we meet at the Sun. It's very informal, but it's amazing what you pick up. So the one last week I went along to, and there I learned all about a new, just in casual conversation, about a new transcription software called Transcribus, I think it's called. Is that right, Simon? Transcribus. And it's extraordinary. So you can put some old text in, you can put Latin text in, you can put in 17th century court hand in, and it will transcribe that into sort of words that you can understand and then work from that. So that was interesting. I hadn't expected to learn that. And then, of course, we have the e-bulletin, which Simon runs and edits, and we've tried to create a new little 300-word space for stories. And Andy Scott over there, Andy, you can wave, has produced a number of different articles. Again, we're also looking out for other contributors. And so, as a final note, I thought I'd cite the great John Cloke again. And at the end of his article about the history of the journal, he said, trying to encourage other people to get involved. There is an enormous amount of material still to be explored and analysed and written up. And he wrote these words in 2004, and it still applies. There's still a lot to be discovered. Any of you too can write history later, but do so, when you do so, base it on the documents. In other words, really focus on the underlying research. We want sort of quality material. That shouldn't put you off, but it should, encourage you to go to the National Archives and start reading some of the fantastic material that's there. Very good. Well, thank you very much for that. And